Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth in our series of 6 conversations on the future of public safety, sponsored by John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. My name is James Cadogan, and I am privileged to be the moderator for this series. And really looking forward to today's conversation, which is about how we invest in and create safer communities. The prior conversations we've had to date have all pointed to the need for a more expansive vision and definition of public safety. And we have a distinguished panel of guests who are going to dig in with us on how we think about the ecosystem of reform and how we create a safe community beyond thinking about just the police department. Today, I'm going to introduce our 6 guests. And first up is Louis Dekmar, the immediate past president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, IACP. Welcome, Chief Dekmar.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We have Tanya Koch, the director of the Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice Program at the Ford Foundation. Welcome, Tanya.
Hi.
We have Daryl Atkinson, the co-director of Ford Justice.
Hey, how you doing, James?
Hey, Daryl. We have Marisa Hugh-Weller, Chief of Staff and Director of the Technology, Corporate Responsibility, and Criminal Justice Reform Program at Microsoft. Welcome, Marisa.
Hi, James. Thanks.
We have the Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, Michael Harrison. Welcome, Commissioner.
Hi, James. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. And we have Celia Willett, the founder and chief executive of the Responsible Business Initiative. Welcome, Celia.
Hi, James. Thank you.
And we will also have joining us the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkin, who will be with us in just a few minutes. So as we have had in prior conversations, what we're really looking for is dialogue across difference. And with the voices that I just introduced, we will get started. I want to bring in first Daryl and Tanya and Celia on a level setting question, a version of what we've asked before in this series, but with a slightly different spin. Previously, we've talked about how do we define public safety. We've gotten some really interesting and rich answers on a new and expansive definition of public safety. In this particular conversation, I want to level set by asking, how should we be defining a safe community? So if we can bring up Daryl, Tanya, and then Celia, would love to hear from each of you from your positions, how you think about defining a safe community and what you want to cue in folks' minds when we say that the term safe community. Daryl, if you could first.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a really interesting one, and one that it's not rocket science, right? You know, when we talk about what healthy, thriving communities need, right, to be just that. And you think about the socioeconomic indicators of health and wellness, right? Opportunities for employment, safe housing, environmental, being able to live in a safe environment, right? Green space, not living in a food desert, all of these various components, as well as, in addition to a police, prosecutorial, and prison function. You add those ingredients to the milieu, it produces an environment where people can live healthy and safe and thrive in lives. I think it's important too to note when we think about that question, what do communities need to be safe? We haven't always considered that question for all communities. We've thought about that in real serious ways for majority white communities. And our public policies, you know, at certain periods of our country have been passed to be illustrative of that. Think, you know, post WW2, how easy we made access to obtaining a home for many Americans, but not for all Americans. And because of some of those housing policies, FHA redlining, for example, right, they had really, really impactful impacts on how people were residentially segregated, which then impacts how those communities are policed and how the distribution of those very resources that provide the socioeconomic indicators for health and wellness are dispersed, right? So I just think we just need to continue to be honest about that when we frame up these public safety conversations, when we frame up these conversations about what communities mean to be whole. We know what they need because we've done it for mainstream America for many, many generations, right? We have neglected and abandoned many communities. And the only hand of government that we give them is the coercive right hand of the state, whereas we don't give them the hand of thriving opportunity and providing those indicators of health and wellness that we know that communities need to be healthy and thriving.
That's a perfect way to kick us off, Daryl. It's not rocket science part of it, but we know how to create healthy communities, but we haven't done it equitably, particularly for Black and Brown communities. That's something that we need to have as an anchor for our conversation. So thanks for starting us off with that. Tanya, if I can come to you.
Sure, thanks. And thank you for that answer, Daryl. And mine is, very much the same. When people ask me this question, I ask them to close their eyes and to just imagine that they are moving their family to a new home in a new community, right? As you look around for a good neighborhood, what matters to you? What do you look for as you drive around? What do you look for as you walk the neighborhood streets? You look for a few things. You look for well-funded, clean and bright schools. You ask about the student-teacher ratio and the graduation rates. You look for clean green space, right, where there's sports teams playing and children playing safely. You look for signs of an economically healthy community, right? Is there a clean and orderly business district without boarded up storefronts? You look for communities that have decent jobs and employment rates where people can feed their families. You look, as Daryl said, for grocery stores, right, that are also clean, decent, providing adequate fresh food. You look to see, are there signs of homelessness, or do people have housing, right? You look for access to good healthcare. You ask, is there a good community hospital around? Are there affordable health services, right? And I think that this is where we have to talk about the fact that where we are now on many of these issues around policing is, racialized poverty, right? And police are responding to disorder that is fundamentally tied to poverty. And we know how to do different because, as Daryl said, those of us, I would bet most of us on this call, are affluent enough to afford to live in neighborhoods that provide those basic social goods. And I think we know what it is. We imagine it. It's not any different for poor Black and Brown communities as it is for anyone else.
And just imagining what safety is, that's a perfect build on Daryl's point in thinking that we know what we have to do. We can imagine it. We have imagined it. We've made it real. But how come we haven't made it real for everybody? And racialized poverty, that's a theme that's come up again and again in these conversations. So thank you for that, Tanya. I want to come to Celia next on the same question.
Thanks so much. I'm not a rocket scientist, and my answer isn't rocket science either. I think we all know what safe feels like because we've all been children at some point, and we know how to take care of children. So, what are the things that make humans feel safe? Being well nourished, feeling sheltered, having their basic needs taken care of. And if I kind of think about what this really boils down to, and what we're seeing failing now is safety is trust that those who are tasked with taking care of you will take care of you, that those who are in a leadership position have your best interests at heart. I think everything that Daryl and Tanya said is what this looks like. But what does this feel like to feel safe? I think those needs are very basic and very human. And safe communities are those communities where those needs are being taken care of by the people who are responsible for providing those services and taking care of people.
The concept of trust and frayed trust is another theme that has come up, and what we're trying to build and thinking about the future of public safety. To that point, I think Mayor Durkan is now here with us. Mayor Durkan, if I can bring you in on this conversation, as a sitting mayor, this is obviously near and dear to your heart. We'd love to get your perspective on what it really means to create a safe community and how you think about creating safety in Seattle.
So I am in complete agreement with what we've heard so far. Is I think too long we've thought of public safety in terms of policing. And let's face it, police show up when everything else is broken or something's gone wrong. And we have seen in our BIPOC communities that we have under-resourced and under-invested those communities, both intentionally and unintentionally, for generations. And if we want true community safety, we have to invest in those things that we've already heard about that we know make communities safe: affordable housing, access to food, access to educational justice, true economic equity, and letting community itself tell you and choose where those investments are made, I think, is also part of it. So in Seattle, I've talked about two things. I think we absolutely need to reimagine and reform policing so that when someone calls 911, we don't just default to the idea that an armed police officer has to respond. It may be a different response that we need: a social worker, crisis intervention specialist, someone who knows the family. But even upstream of that, we have to invest strongly in community and let community guide that. So in my budget, which I'll be announcing next week, I've committed at the beginning of this summer that I would commit $100 million new dollars into the BIPOC communities in Seattle and let those communities say what they needed and where those dollars should go. And I think we have to do that sustained over a period of 7 to 10 years, because in Seattle, you know, we are a city that's predominantly white, but there's a neighborhood that is one of the richest communities in terms of true community connections. But kids there, it's largely Latinx. Kids in that community have a shorter life expectancy than kids in a predominantly white neighborhood just miles away. That's wrong. And if we truly want community safety, we got to focus on community. And community has to be empowered. And we have to really admit and acknowledge that our country has systemic racism, not just in policing, but in every other institution that makes a community healthy and thriving. And we can't dismantle it until we acknowledge it. And then we have to empower the community itself to make those choices, make those investments, and truly build equity.
The idea of the pervasiveness of systemic racism is another through line that we've been talking about. So thank you for acknowledging it. But also I want to stick with you just for a second before I bring in Commissioner Harrison, Marisa, and Chief Dekmar, because we really want to dig into the question of budget. We've seen the conversation in headlines across the country about defund, divest, and abolish the police, which in prior conversations, we've really come to the point where we're discussing a allocation of resources with a finite budget. And you just said you're committing $100 million new dollars into the BIPOC community in Seattle, which is incredible. Could you just give us a very brief taste of what it is you're thinking about and then why you made that announcement recently?
So we have, you know, we're like most cities in America, we're looking at our police budget and figuring out what is the police force we really need in a community and fund that. But I think it's just as wrong to tell community that they only get what we can carve from police. That gives police and the police budget and frame of public safety almost as much dictation and control over that. What we have to say instead is we really want to invest at a high enough level. And so when we looked at the budget, it was, we will continue to probably shrink the profile of police or as we reimagine what their role is and build the budget to what we really need. We still need an armed police presence in Seattle for certain types of calls 24/7, but we need to build up the capability to have a harm reduction model that's true. At the same time, communities shouldn't have to wait for the level of investment that they need in affordable housing and access to healthcare, childcare, education justice. And so in looking at the budget, I wanted to not just have, depend on the divest invest framework, but to say, look, we have to invest at least this much over a period of years, regardless and as we are doing that other endeavor.
Thank you so much for that, Mayor Durkin. I want to bring in Celia and then Commissioner Harrison and Chief Dekmar on this question of budgets. And this is really where we want to spend some time, because a lot of the discussion that we have on policing and thinking about public safety in the future really is about resourcing, as the mayor just said. So I'd love to get each of your perspectives on how we should be adapting our municipal budgeting processes and our appropriations to try to further that conception of public safety, because at the end of the day, this does come down to resources and policy practice, but the resource part of it goes under-heralded in our discussions as how we get from here to the future of public safety. Celia first, if you could. I'm sorry, I brought up Marisa. If you could.
The other Sabella, my name on here. Hi everyone, thanks. It's Marie Weller at Microsoft, and this is a great question. Obviously, so just a brief intro. I lead the Justice Reform Initiative at the company, and it's part of a multi-pronged strategy to really be investing in communities, not just from the justice reform angle, but from the broader conception of racial justice and how a corporation, which cannot do it all on its own, does need to not just step back when things get difficult, but really step up in times like this, and when and kind of have an enduring commitment to racial justice as well. In terms of resourcing, I think you've seen over the years Microsoft be a very willing partner and collaborator with government to figure out how we can bring our resources to bear, advancing things like affordable housing in King County, for example, and creating a fund to create more opportunities for people to live here, especially those who are civil servants who work and serve the community, as well, and specifically as it relates to justice reform and policing. In 2017, the company provided $400,000 in matching funds to the state of Washington to revamp its police training, heralded by Sue Rohr, at the Justice Training Center, and specifically to look at our command leadership and how we help infuse and shift culture toward thinking of our law enforcement officers as guardians of the community versus more of the kind of militarized warrior mentality. And so she started that work in 2017, and we're proud to continue to support it as well. So I do think that there's just an opportunity, more so than ever perhaps, for private sector and public sector to work together to figure out, well, where can we lend resources? So that's my take. I'm very interested to hear from the other panelists as well.
Thanks so much, Marisa. And Chief Dekmar, if you could.
Sure. Well, I think probably a way to start is to look at historically, how has the police arrived at where they're at today? And the fact is, in my agency, and I believe this is, I know for a fact nationally, 10% of what the police are involved in actually has to do with crime that results in an arrest. About 90% of what we do is some form of social work, intervention, referral, mediation, problem solving. And that has evolved over time because of the neglect, much to the mayor's point, of these other services not adequately being funded and landing at the door of the police. And let me just give you one extreme. 60, when we were a country of 150 million, we had over 600,000 inpatient beds for those affected by mental illness. Today, we're a country of over 330 million, and we have less than 60,000. And so in essence, what we've done is we've criminalized mental illness. The three largest mental illness treatment centers in this country, Rikers Island, Cook County Jail, Los Angeles County Jail. My trepidation about cutting the police and defunding the police before you upload these services is that there's going to be a disparity in the response and the resources that are available. So what I would expect is that communities that are truly interested in beginning to shift the social work interventions that police do to other resources is you maintain the status quo with the police, you start infusing investments in these other services, and then as the calls drop from police response, you begin to adjust that police resource according to those reduced calls. But if you start reducing the police numbers without the resources there, I'm afraid what you're going to end up with is chaos.
Two really important things I took from that, Chief. Number one, the 10% crime arrest work versus 90% social work is a really important framing for this conversation. And then the idea of leveling out and thinking about maintaining police status quo in terms of budgeting while investing in these other services that otherwise need to pick up the slack for what police are first responders for is a really helpful way to think about our next steps.
One other point.
Please, go ahead.
With regard to mental illness, because we've got individuals that are severely mentally ill. 25% of fatal police shootings are individuals affected by mental illness. There was a study done 7-8 years ago, looked at 707 police-involved shootings, 36% suicide by cop or individuals affected by mental illness. We've got an individual in our city, the police have responded 70 times since 2015, and I'm sure the commissioner has a host of those experiences that he could share.
You're picking up on something that we talked about last week with medical professionals about what it takes to care for public safety and public health and welfare at the same time. And that's a really important point about the overrepresentation of people with serious mental illness in terms of officer-involved fatalities and shootings. Thank you, Chief. Commissioner, if you could.
Yeah, James, thank you so much. And look, everybody said it so well. The chief has said it almost exactly like I have been saying it, not just here, but in calls around the country, about the gap that's created when you defund police. Two things will either happen. When you defund the police and cut the money from our budget, and by the way, our city council cut mine a couple of months ago by $22 million. Either we cut the budget and we expect the police to do the same work with fewer dollars, or we cut the budget and move the work away to another entity. So the question remains, is that entity even in existence? Is it built, and is it ready to accept what we're handing off, which in the classic example would be calls for mental illness? And or do we create a gap in services where we have been the responder 24/7 because there has been this investment in that other entity that doesn't exist? And because we're the agency that has been in the community, able to respond 24/7 within a couple of minutes, now we want to pass the work on to, and we should, because there are people who are better served to do it. But are they a 24/7 operation? Is the dynamic in the entity built, and can they handle it to the level we're handling it? Because if they're not, we create a gap. Now, the way the chief explained it is almost how I explain it. I use the analogy, James, of building a stadium. Never do we tear down a stadium to play a game in a new stadium. What we do is we build a new stadium, and while we're building the stadium, we continue to play a game in the old stadium until the new one is built. Then we transition into the new stadium, and once we're there, we then tear down the old stadium. That's the same analogy you heard the chief talking about. If we don't do it that way, then we create a gap, and we sometimes create more harm than good, because we have been required to respond to all of these calls that others are better suited to do, but have not been doing it because of the disinvestment. But we have adapted, we've overcome, we'll do it again. And I think we've been asked to be all things to all people. I think what we're reimagining about police is what really should we be doing, and what's the expectation of police going forward. We have to make the investment in all the things you heard all the other panelists talk about, but some of them are not ready to pick up and run with it right now. So it has to be, how do we invest in them, and how do we decrease the reliance on police over time so that we don't create gaps in the process that create more harm?
Transition analogies are really important and visual, and I think a great thing for us to hold on to as we continue this discussion. I want to bring in Celia, Tanya, and Daryl just to respond and talk about how they see, from non-law enforcement perspectives, the current debate around defunding, abolishing, or divesting from the police. Starting with you, Celia, we'd love to get your perspective and hear how you're seeing this from the business community.
Yeah. From the business community, there's been an extraordinary amount of permission for businesses to use their platforms, their leverage, their power to lift up important issues, to listen to community members, to try and be part of the innovation of change here. I think a place that businesses, what I'm seeing from businesses is that businesses acutely feel the need to educate, and they also feel that they have permission and opportunity to educate themselves, which is, I think, kind of unusual. Businesses are often seen as needing to have all the answers, kind of buttoned up. So, you know, one of the programs that RBIJ is like in the process of launching in response to the current climate is actually an educative and sort of proximity gaining program for businesses. It's unbelievably helpful for the criminal justice reform community because businesses are incredible allies and really powerful and valuable partners at the table. But it's valuable for businesses because never before has speaking out about current social and political issues been so much a matter of survival. But kind of talking about the invest, divest, defund debate, like I think in the business community, there's a lot of conversation, maybe socially, there's a lot of conversation about allocate and reallocate. And I think this picks up a little bit on, what Chief Dekmar and Commissioner Harrison was saying, which is police are often ill-equipped to respond to the things that they're called to respond to. So who is better equipped, and how do we support those? I think there's been incredible innovation in the business community around this. There's a company in Kentucky that comes to mind. It's called Dorman Products. It's a facility in Kentucky, and they actually created a program, sort of a Venn diagram program with a nonprofit organization, where they would employ and support people returning to the community after addiction, which, as we know, is often sort of intersects with spending time in prison, and is also very similar in many ways when we talk about re-entry from addiction or re-entry from prison in terms of the support that people need. So that was a company that recognized that if they gave those people jobs, that they would be much more likely to succeed in their rehabilitation process. But they also recognized that that community needed additional services that a company wouldn't usually provide, basically social services. So things like support with obtaining housing, budget planning, vocational training. And so they actually partnered with a nonprofit organization, and they sort of, like I said, they operate in a sort of Venn diagram. The nonprofit works with that company, but it also works in the community. The community works with that nonprofit, but it also hires people that aren't returning from addiction. So, this is a small example of how in one community, and that community being a business, that effective partnerships, real efficiency by finding an organization that was already doing something that they needed, that they could then support and sort of ask them to do something that lined up with what they were doing. The two became greater than the sum of their parts, and the outcome, sort of from an allocation point of view, was exactly the same. And I think it's worth saying that wasn't Dorman Products' sort of charity offering. That's a company that's actually really successful. And has sort of doubled or quadrupled its profit margins over the last few years. So they recognized that actually there was potential for progress and advantage both to themselves and to the community. And I think when we think, I promise I'm finishing here, when we think about what allocation and reallocation looks like, there are ways where this can actually benefit all of the parties involved, and no one is kind of disadvantaged as a result.
I love that. Allocate, reallocate, and thinking about effective partnerships, which is something that has come up previously in our conversations. I want to come to Tanya next on, you're sitting in the philanthropy space as a leader in the justice field. How do you hear the cries to defund, divest, or abolish police, and what perspective would you bring to that conversation?
Well, James, I work for a foundation, the Ford Foundation, whose mission is all built around dismantling inequality. I work for a division of the foundation that is focused on dismantling mass incarceration and the growth of the carceral state. So the conversation that we are having and the opportunity that these young activists in the movement for Black Lives have given us around divesting from police and reinvesting in community health and welfare is a completely welcome and overdue one, in my view. Our foundation, I think many others who work on justice reform, had not really focused much on the police, even though it is the gateway to a massive system of incarceration that's doing harm. And the reason for that is that politically, it seemed impossible, right, to question more money for the police or even taking even modest amounts of money away from the police. And so I think what we now have is the opportunity for a really robust conversation about what really makes for public safety, right? And this is where I really appreciate Mayor Durkin's point about not confining the discussion of budgets to the police, right? Because we actually need to do much more, right, than simply what, the dollars we can save from police departments. I think we need a wholesale reevaluation of what is, an eroding tax base, right, that cannot adequately provide for the kind of social welfare that one of the richest countries in the world should be affording its citizens. I think the truth is that we're all swimming in the consequences of the Reagan Revolution that's discredited the notion of a progressive tax system and the notion that people all need to contribute to our collective well-being, right? And this is where I think that this is where I think that we let philanthropy off too easy and we let corporations off too easy, right? The truth is that philanthropy has seen an enormous increase in our sector in the last 10 to 15 years as a result of income inequality. And the truth is that if the billionaires who are funding our foundations were actually advocating for a progressive tax system, actually paying their fair share in taxes, we would be able to afford these investments and inputs that I think we are all agreeing make for a safe and healthy community, right? And philanthropy is very much, I think, trading around the edges, right, by funding the symptoms rather than addressing the problem. But here too, I think corporations have a responsibility to do much more. It is not enough for corporations to do a little public-private program here on the side around a particular intervention program or an after-school program. The truth is that corporations are part of the problem of a broken capitalist system, right? That is driving inequality. And those corporations need to rethink how much they are paying people at the bottom of their pay scale and paying living wages that can actually produce and power economically healthy communities, right? That will ultimately be the solution to poverty, right? We need not just more jobs, but better jobs that pay better wages. And I don't see any way around this problem, treating it as a problem of a paucity of programs instead of a problem of poverty.
You packed a lot in there, Tanya. This is really helpful. Just to recap briefly, the idea of the moment that we're in and the opportunity that this incredibly effective grassroots organizing has presented us with is a baseline and an incubation for a lot of this discussion about a new public safety. So I really appreciate you raising that. And the notion that we shouldn't let philanthropy or corporations off the hook with piecemeal programs, as distinct from thinking systemically about what creates poverty and how we can attack those root causes and hold ourselves responsible, is really important. So thank you for that. Coming to you, Daryl, your perspective on the defund, abolish, divest debate.
Yeah, we need a domestic Marshall Plan. You know what I mean? To really have a fundamental reordering of our society and various priorities and how we use our resources and time, talents, and treasures. But just without getting too caught up in that big question, kind of, I guess, drilling down to your specific question in this kind of really false dichotomy of fund or defund, invest, divest, because, we're always making those decisions all the time. Those aren't new decisions, right? But it's kind of tough. And I understand that the commissioner's job, and the head of an institution as a police chief, your job is to protect that institution and protect their budget and to protect the vitality of that particular institution, and that includes in protecting the budget. But it's kind of difficult to hear as a civil rights lawyer who sues police departments, as a formerly incarcerated person who's been beaten up by the police and been beaten up by prison guards, it's kind of tough to hear that if we don't continue to give the police the same amount of money, we're going to get a gap in services. Because see what happened in Rochester, New York, when a black man who's naked in the middle of the street, who's obviously in a mental health crisis, where the police put a spit hood over his head that results in his death, that don't sound like services to me. My community don't see that as services. And if those are the services you are providing, we certainly want a gap in that. We don't want no more of that. And it's hearkening back to really, you know, I'm a son of the South. My parents on my mother's side, my mom is from Tuskegee, Alabama. I was born on campus, on campus, in fact, and all of my people are from down there. And it really harkens back to that period of my grandmother and grandfather's period when they were coming up in the city, that things would happen within our community that were needed to be addressed, where folks needed to be held accountable. Somebody might drink too much and hit a loved one. Somebody might steal another one's tools or something along those lines. But they weren't calling Bull Connor to come adjudicate that issue, because Bull Connor was going to bring more harm to the community than good. Many of our communities are in that very same place, and what we need are the resources and the agencies to determine how we want to deal with those issues ourselves without having the state involved, right? And so we're seeing that kind of innovation happen all around the country. So for example, in Durham, the Durham Beyond Policing Coalition rose up and was able to block a budget request from our police chief of adding additional 72 officers would have added $2.2 some odd million to the policing budget. They were able to block that, but they just weren't blocking it and saying we don't have an alternative. They were saying, help us incubate this community-based task force that can then tap into the other socioeconomic indicators of health and wellness, where we have public services available that can help our communities. Help us fund more local nonprofits, because as noted, academician Pat Sharkey has found in some of his research that in cities, big cities, where they had a significant concentration of nonprofits per 100,000 residents, that they saw rates of violent crime go down. Because it isn't just the police that keeps us safe. Think about the time, and our organizers help us go through this exercise to help community even envision what safety can look like outside of the policing context. And they ask people to think about the time where you felt the most safe. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, revel in that. Remember the smells, remember the images, remember the people who are around. And then they go around the room and they have people share what their reflections were, to get an idea of what people feel about safety. And every time, James, people talk about, man, when I was at the family barbecue or the church picnic or the community block party, I felt really safe. Never do they say, when they showed up with that paramilitary tactical gear and the helicopters, I feel real safe. When they had the AR-15 and was knocking down, kicking in the door across the street, I felt real safe. They never say that. So what we really need to be tapping into is what the community's aspirations and dreams are, and funding what they need to be safe.
Framing, Daryl, and the idea of agency and self-determination being critical to creating public safety, and what we should be investing in as community agency and self-determination is so very important. Marisa, if I can bring you in.
Yeah, this is great. I'm loving this conversation. I feel like, okay, here we go. Now we're getting into it. But I wanted to build on a point, Tanya, that you made around, corporations and philanthropy, and kind of the difference between programs and initiatives and actual enduring impact. Because I think that what we are striving for isn't just activity in these areas, but really how does philanthropy, how do business meaningfully contribute to enduring economic agency, economic equality, and thinking about not just also more jobs, better jobs, well-paying jobs. But then also, how does a company think about using all of the tools that in its economic tool chest, if you will, to contribute to that? And so for us, one piece of that is we have committed to, over the next 3 years, double the number of African American Black owned suppliers with whom we spend, basically, which will result in a net new $500 million with companies, organizations that are Black owned. And I mention that just not because it's like, oh, look at us, we're so great, but it's trying to think really creatively around what are the tools and levers we all have that we can apply toward this, because it's not just about one piece of a particular puzzle. I think about the work I lead around justice reform as a necessary but not sufficient piece of the puzzle of it, having a company like Microsoft try to really dig in on racial justice and racial equity. So I just appreciated, Tanya, your comment about we need to be all raising the bar of what's expected for corporations and for philanthropy as we think about this issue.
Agree completely. Thank you for that point. Right, they're hiring, and there's racial justice, racial equity hiring, and subcontracting that we and corporations need to be thinking about too. So I appreciate that point.
Thank you both for this. Is a really important thread of our conversation. I'm going to turn to Mayor Durkin and Commissioner Harrison and Chief Deckmer to dig in on the practicalities here. So once we're talking about how we reinvest, give us some sense of how you think about specific programmatic investments that you need to make. I know, Madam Mayor, you just talked about the $100 million in new dollars that you want to invest. Would love to peel that back a little bit and hear how you would frame to our viewing audience who are coming to this and thinking about this new future of public safety we want to capture together. What is it we should be investing in? We'd love to hear all three of your perspectives, but starting with the Mayor.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm answer that, but I also just want to echo, I agree about rejiggering what our whole economic and taxation framework is. We have put so much on cities, and can I tell you as a mayor, we are now the safety net for America. And until we revamp our federal tax base and corporations don't try to make money for their shareholders that tend to be founders, venture capitalists, and the like, they do it for workers, and they do it so that this wealth is spread. I think we will have these kinds of conversations and others. When it comes to the practical parts of policing, so I think that we know what worked. So I want to take the $100 million, and I think something that has been said a couple of times from a couple of different people here is self-determination and self-empowerment is critical. For my $100 million proposal, there will be a community-led group. There'll be a task force that will listen to community, decide where that money needs to be invested, how it needs to be invested, and come up with a 7 to 10 year plan for each year to be at that level so that we get the outcomes that we want. And we've done that in other areas. We passed a large levy that increased the amount of free preschool, really good preschool, and it's mostly free preschool and used by communities of color, and 2 years free college for every high school graduate. And the people who are taking advantage of that are usually our students of color. So we know there's programs that can work over a period of time and have outcomes. When it comes to policing, we also know there's programs that can be harm reduction programs that work. And I disagree with the notion that you have to wait till you've rebuilt the whole department before you can make the investments. We have to start making those investments now, but we can start with things that are harm reduction models now too, without having to change the whole police department. I'll give you 2 examples. When I came in as mayor, I got an evaluation. I said, I want to know where my police are responding. What are the top 5 places and types of crimes we're responding to? Of those top 5 places, 3 of them, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, were homeless shelters. And the types of responses were what the chiefs has said is it's predominantly people who are in crisis, maybe experiencing homelessness, mental health crisis, or addiction. So we did a couple of things that have shown real results. Number 1, in my budget, I put full-time nurses to be located in those shelters so they could provide de-escalation. They could work with people, see if they need to be connected with a case manager, have a healthcare response, get them out of crisis and call police as the last resort. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it does reduce the number of times they have to call police. We also looked at the downtown core and saw time and time again, we had police responding to a 911 call. They come to somebody who is in some behavioral health crisis, maybe not committing a crime at that moment, but clearly there was a issue that needed to be dealt with. Well, those police had really two choices: either arrest the person for something and take them to jail, which is the worst intervention for someone who's in crisis, or take them to the nearby hospital, which also didn't work. So we started a program that we call Health One. It's like a Medic One response, where instead of police rolling to those cases, we have a specially trained unit that is one firefighter and one social worker who respond to the person and see what they need to get that person stabilized. Do they need medical assistance? They get taken to the hospital. Do they need to be connected to their caseworker? They get that. So there are interventions we know work, but we do have to scale them so they're available 24/7 in every community. But again, I want to come back to the things is community needs to be guiding this discussion. For too long and too many generations, our society has provided gatekeepers and told Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, here's what you need, and here's the crumbs you get around the margins. We have to stop that thinking. We have got to invest at the same level we've invested in other communities and let communities themselves drive the solutions. And I think if we do that, you will get community safety, which is far more enduring than public safety.
Many things there, Mayor Durkin. The idea of participatory budgeting and making sure that it is community-led over a long period of time. We previously talked with other panelists about the mismatch between policy time horizons and electoral time horizons. And the fact that you're thinking so far out is really important. And the notion that we can actually get to community safety as distinct from public safety gets us back to our definitions question, which I, again, really appreciate. Chief Deckmar, if I can...
Before you get to the next...
Sure, please.
Is also, I think there's so much discussion around that. I believe that if you put cops at one table and community members at another table and said, write 3 things that you wish cops weren't doing right now and somebody else should do, those lists would be nearly identical. Because we are more and more, police are responding to those situations where it's because so much is broken above that, whether it's the foster care system, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's addiction or mental health or homelessness. And so if we had better resilient structures, harm reduction structures to deal with that, our police then would be able to optimize their response and be more connected to the community. So I think that long-term solution is better for community and better for police.
Chief Deckmar, I would love to get your response to that.
One is, no police chief or law enforcement professional is going to support the kind of responses that have been described regarding showing up, with the AR-15 and escalating the situation. The facts are use of force in policing is very rare. Fatal police shootings are rare. More people are killed in hospitals by staph infections in a week than are killed by police officers in a year. We go to hundreds of millions of police calls a year. We're assaulted 50,000 times a year, 10,000 feloniously, and we take the life of right around 1,000 folks, despite the fact we're making somewhere between 11 and 12 million arrests. In those instances, though, where the police have behaved in a way that's outrageous, illegal, it ought to be quickly condemned, it ought to be prosecuted, and it ought to be addressed, and there ought to be clear accountability. And those agencies that don't do that make it more difficult for the agencies that are committed to these principles. I agree, what the mayor is saying, I agree with, because she apparently has in place those resources to fill the gap. She's got the nurses, she's got the paramedics. My colleagues that I talk to, where there is discussions and in some cases the funding occurring, those resources have not been allocated, and those organizations or agencies to deal with those situations have not been created or implemented. And I would also say that many of the incidents that involve law enforcement, these are repeat calls. Officers make referrals. officers refer them to other resources, and the resources spin them around and send them back out the door. This is frequently occurs at hospitals with homelessness and individuals affected by mental illness. They go in, they spin them around 3 times, give them a shower, and they're back out. So the intervention by the police in many instances is very successful, but what isn't successful is the commitment of resources to intervene in a way that's long-term and prevents a re-encounter with the police.
Much, Chief. Commissioner Harrison.
Agree with the mayor and everything she talked about, especially with harm reduction programs that allow police departments to offset some of the work, because we're actually working on prevention and intervention programs instead of having to respond to it all. I fully in support that. That's what we're doing here in Baltimore. And I actually fully agree with Darrell's point earlier, and I want to make sure I'm clear about that. When I talk about creating a gap, here in Baltimore, there was a demand for the police to stop being dispatched to mental illness calls. But the city has no organization to respond to them in our place. The only organization does not have the capacity to handle the full city and cannot handle 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the demand for us to stop would have created a gap because nobody else is there to pick it up. Thus, we have to transition into either a joint model or creating another model for someone else to respond. Had we stopped, we would have created more harm than good. And I think that's the gap I was referring to. But even in my time as chief in New Orleans, and now in Baltimore, I'm faced with 2 different things, but responding the same way. A police officer narrative that we're so understaffed and we're so short of police officers that it is critical. We went from having 1,550 police officers to less than 1,200 in New Orleans over a period of time. And through that consent decree and through redesigning and reimagining what the police department should be doing and should not be doing, we were able to do more with less, and then find out that we were able to have a fully staffed police department to handle everything should be handling with a smaller amount of officers and a smaller budget. Likewise, in Baltimore, an officer-led narrative that we're so sharp, we're critical. They're used to having 3,000 plus officers, and now that we're less than 2,500, it feels as though we're incredibly short. But now that we're redesigning and reimagining what we should and should not be doing, we're actually able to deliver the appropriate police services with a smaller department, thus a smaller budget. And by the way, we're down in every crime category. And so the proof is actually even the pudding, and we're now going to reimagine even further what we should and should not be doing, and then using that money to create programmatic solutions that help us on the front end. I am fully in support of it. My issue is how do we do it, and when do we do it that doesn't create a gap because someone else is not ready to pick up what we stop providing.
That's a perfect transition, Commissioner. The idea of making sure that we don't have gaps and that we are reimagining and redesigning in a smart way that allows for services to still be provided. I want to bring in Celia, Darrell, Tanya, and Marisa, if I can, because this is something that for each of you in your positions, you get to see a broad swath of our society and multiple different industries and think about where you're making investments, how you're doing your advocacy, and would love to get your perspective on how we coordinate all of this and make sure that there aren't those gaps, that we do that handoff, and that we actually manage to graduate from not just imagining the future, but seizing the future program by program, initiative by initiative, community by community. If I can come to Celia first.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. If it's okay, I'd kind of like to backtrack a little bit, because I feel like there's a piece of this that I keep getting stuck on, which is that we have extraordinary people on this panel, and we have extraordinary leaders who are motivated and willing to take a fresh look and to kind of be vehicles of change and to be sort of conduits of change. But I don't know about my fellow colleagues in the criminal justice reform movement on this call, but there are these roadblocks that we keep coming across that, while we can imagine and envision and show examples of what a rebuild looks like, that that will never kind of motivate or change those that aren't inspired to create change, like the commissioner and the chief and the mayor on this call, unless we also reimagine policy and politics. If we don't remove those roadblocks, if we don't remove those hurdles, then we're going to be back here with the next Breonna Taylor, with the next George Floyd. I mean, with the next like Tamir Rice, with the next kind of egregious murders of these kinds. So for me, I feel like there's a piece of this, and part of the reason why I now work with businesses, my background is actually in legal defense, in criminal defense, was how do you create systemic change, and how do you remove roadblocks that exist within that system? And maybe a good example of this, because to sort of imagine this, is we know that that jobs help reduce recidivism rates, right? So we know that people who leave prison are statistically very likely. Recidivism rates in America vary from state to state, but sit around 50%, which is really, really high. Literally half of people who leave prison will go on to commit another crime, and those crimes are then make communities less safe. So how do we imagine what a new safer community is? Well, let's reduce recidivism rates. Like, that's going to reduce crime overall. What's a great way to reduce recidivism rates? Give people jobs. Amazing. Get a bunch of businesses that are jazzed up about the idea about hiring people with former convictions. Maybe they're banning the box. Maybe they're eliminating questions in interviews. Maybe they're not doing background searches on certain low-level offenses. But then we run into problems like lack of reentry services, how hard it is to get a criminal record expunged, bans on professional licensing for people who are convicted of criminal convictions. So I think, even when we talk about how we reimagine budgets and what budgets should look like, policy, politics, and change kind of all sit together. Personally, the reason why I ended up working with businesses was because the communities that I had served were typically the least powerful voices at the table. I work with people who are incarcerated, who are in jail, who are facing very long sentences. I mostly worked on death penalty cases, and those people traditionally lack power. So for me, I felt that building power at the table, that means raising up and empowering members of underserved and underinvested in communities, and bringing powerful allies to the table. So when we think about, what could businesses do and how does everything fit together, I think we have to think about, Marisa said it so well, we look at our assets, we look at our leverage. I think we have to look at both change and rebuild.
So, Celia, you anticipated my next question on what are the obstacles stopping us from making all of this real. So since you anticipated that, to Daryl, Tanya, and Marisa, feel free to jump in on that question of what's the obstacle in our political system, or we can go to the multi-sectoral question. Dealer's choice, starting with Daryl.
Yeah, I'm gonna first reserve some time for rebuttal, James, but I wanted to I wanted to go to something that Chief Dekmar has brought up a couple of times related to the high utilizers, right? People who are consistently interfacing our local jails, hospitals, if we have any kind of community-based mental health centers. And once again, James, we kind of studied this issue when we were in the Obama administration. The single biggest intervention that you can have that's evidence-based, is proven, is permanent supportive housing with intensive case management. It's been proven, right, to interrupt the cycle of high utilizers. That takes not just a commitment from police, right, to, if those folks were in any way to come in contact with them, to try to refer them back to their case management kind of protocol, but it also takes a commitment from the other parts of society that have a function in producing that permanent supportive housing, in producing that wraparound case management, right? So I just want to lift up again, these are not new things that we have to, let's have a task force and a Blue Ribbon Commission and let's go study this thing again. We already have a lot of answers to these things, right? And we could be implementing these things if we so fit. with regards to some of the other models that I've found effective, some of my or seen effective, some of my work while I was at DOJ as a fellow. And it was in your neck of the woods, Commissioner, from Baltimore, and we visited Sand Hills, and we visited some of the cure violence models and violence interrupters, where community people who were formerly incarcerated, people who were former gang members, once again, evidence-based proven that they've had some of the best results in interrupting violence at a community level before there's even a call for service, right? When the beef is even percolating, right? We've seen those interventions be able to prove effective, because like what you all have found from in the policing context, from some of that technology, whether it's scattershot or the different kind of databases that let you know where the shooting has come from. The violence in our community is coming from a very small subset of people, right? And if we can identify and ameliorate beef before it happens with that very small subset of people, and that's even been shown, proven in some of David Kennedy's work in his High Point model, High Point, North Carolina, right? With the street safe stuff, that you can even give people a choice, like, hey, you can go through door number 1 or door number 2. But the efficacy in bringing up that example is that the violence is coming from a small amount of people. Why set up a policy and practice regime in community that puts the whole community under siege when it's 2 folks doing the shooting, right? That makes no sense, and it turns the very community against you, right? With regards to some of the bigger structural changes and some of the obstacles that are in the way of those bigger structural changes, let's just be really, really honest. I mean, I see it as 3 major kind of pillars of evil that are keeping, us not having the perfect union that we ultimately want to see, right? Structural racism that work in service of white supremacy and is baked into every single institution in our country. Patriarchy, right? It's a reason why Black men were given the vote before all women, right? And it's, once again, patriarchy and male domination and women not being equally exalted, because once we see women more embedded in various institutions, they produce different outcomes. We see that in policing and corrections as well. And then lastly, capitalism. This system does not work for everyone. And we have to have a fundamental reordering of society. There is too much wealth concentrated in too few hands. And so we can talk about these, hey, let's give folks some jobs. There are not enough jobs. And we don't want to be honest that our economy is not set up to produce enough jobs that produce livable wages for people, because we have these big, huge conglomerates and CEOs making huge amounts of money, right? Let's just be honest. These are the huge structural barriers that are standing in the way of the fundamental change that our people want to see.
Daryl, you took us to church again. Structural racism, patriarchy, capitalism. I so appreciate those points. Marisa, I want to come to you next on this.
That's great. Yeah. Thanks, James. And thank you, Daryl, as always. I want to kind of take us back to, I think, the original question, which is, how do we improve cross-sectoral, multi-sectoral coordination on these issues? And I was jotting down some things because it made me think about a quote that is not new, but I recently reheard from the CEO or president of MasterCard, Shamina Singh, around kind of building off of the old proverb, you could go fast or you could go far. And, she said so eloquently, if you want to go wide, go with government. If you want to go deep, go with NGOs and academia. If you want to go fast, go with private sector. But if you want to go far, go together. And I feel like this panel and this series of conversations, I think, is a great example of that in and of itself. But I really don't have an answer for, and this is the beautiful way that you achieve that, cross-sectoral coordination perfectly. I just know that in our particular circumstance, something that we have really rallied around is the power of convening around data. And, in part that's our bet as a data and technology company, but bringing multiple sectors to the table to talk about, well, what does the data show? What can we learn from it? A particular example I'm thinking of right now is the work we've been able to do and start with, continue for the National Police Foundation on the CompStat 360 model. where there was a mayoral task force that had some thoughts and really great ideas around how do we integrate community sentiment, community feedback into how police departments measure success, essentially KPIs, if you will, to borrow kind of a more corporate-y phrase. And our first implementation site is Tampa Bay, Florida, the first of 5 sites. And so we'll be walking alongside that process to provide data support, visualization support. But the thing that I'd like to say around the data thing is not so much it's data for the sake of data, but what I've experienced so far is the data is out there, it exists, it tends to be actually publicly available, but it's not available in a way that even the holders of that data, even the government, can meaningfully, derive insights and drive change. And so our kind of overarching theory has been more meaningful access to data, to drive transparency, to create accountability so that we can enact smart change in our communities. So one, I guess it's a plug or an invite to the extent that folks on this call are thinking about how to tackle really complex data issues. We are a more than willing partner to help think through that. And so that's at least our contribution that we can provide in terms of providing that multi-sectoral coordination on these very complex issues.
Thank you, Marissa, for rating data, but not just data for data's sake, data in service of something that has to be accessible and placed into the actual machinery of how we govern ourselves. That's a really important distinction. So I so appreciate that point. Tanya, if I can come to you.
Sure, thank you. I want to link the previous discussion, the thread we were discussing about crisis response, to this question of what sort of multi-sectoral initiative we need and what's the obstacle. With regard to crisis response services, I would say yes, we need crisis response, but I would go further upstream. I think we need to ask ourselves, why are there so many children in foster care? Why are so many homeless people having mental health crises on the street? Why are so many people addicted to drugs in the first place? Because those are all signs of an unhealthy community, right? And if people don't have adequate housing, food, income, healthcare in the first instance, what we get are neglected children, we get stress, we get trauma that leads to drug addiction and untreated mental illness, right? That then require the crisis response, right? That we're debating. And it just seems to me that by not seeing people's humanity and needs in the first place, we create these downstream problems, right? That then become emergencies. And I just want to say to Marissa, I really appreciate your framing about going wide, deep, and thoughtfully. I'm going to ask you to send me that analogy that you.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
I heard it from somebody else, so.
The truth is that we need all of those sectors, government, nonprofit, private sector, but you also need public will, and you need political will of our leaders. And that, frankly, has been a huge obstacle to change here, right? You have concentrated wealth and runaway capitalism, right? I don't, frankly, see the business sector talking about its own role in creating inequality and all of these downstream problems. I don't hear people talking about, fixing shareholder-driven capitalism. And thank you, Mayor Durkan, for raising that, because that is a huge part of the problem. I don't hear people talking about renovating our tax base, right? A lot of the obstacles here are lack of government funding for social supports. And I have to say, it is inescapable that another huge obstacle here is racism, right? The truth is that in this country, we do not see Black people, brown people, or poor people as deserving and fully human, right? And until this country really confronts its legacy of slavery and genocide and the ways in which we continue to treat these populations as less than human, we will not make progress. We will not make progress.
Been framing this conversation and why we've been grateful for the sponsorship of NOBLE, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and John Jay College of Criminal Justice, who are raising and training the next generation of justice leaders and police officers and advocates. This is a really important American issue, but it is uniquely inflected and rooted in race. And unless we have the kind of truth and reconciliation that you talked about, unless we have these hard conversations right now in the context of policy and how we move forward, then we're not going to make any progress. One of the things that this gets back to our question of obstacles is that as long as there's been policing, we studied policing. As long as there's been housing, we've studied housing equity, but we haven't done the things that we needed to do. And so for that, I actually want to turn to Mayor Durkan and bring you in on this question, because multi-sectoral coordination, the obstacles that we have in our political system to getting things done, how do you see that as a sitting mayor, and how do you weave all these things together in your decision-making framework as you move forward?
So I have to agree with Tanya, and I think these are all interrelated with one thing. Right now, and I don't mean this in a political sense, but the largest obstacle to changing America in this fashion is the person sitting in the White House. And then it's reflected in our Congress and the way it's gridlocked. If you look at, right now we are just at an unprecedented time. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, and we had no federal leadership. And it was cities who at first were figuring it out. We had an economic crisis that is related to that. And again, it's cities who feel it first. Now we're in the middle of a civil rights reckoning, and it's playing out on the streets of cities. So mayors are in this position with their police chiefs and their city councils trying to figure it out. We won't change it without a coherent national strategy. And we have to recognize those upstream causes. It's like Daryl said, we know what works and we know what's broken. And it's what Tanya says, we lack the collective will to fix it. And as long as it's out of sight and out of mind for the majority of Americans, it won't get fixed. And I think that's one of the things that has been so important about the protests we've seen since the murder of George Floyd is it cannot be out of sight or out of mind. But if we look at every social determinant, or even the impacts of the crisis we're facing now, who suffered most from this global pandemic? It's people of color, Black Americans and Latinx in our state. Who suffered from the economic crisis? Again, our communities of color. If you look at healthcare outcomes, education outcomes, that shows you it is baked into the systems. And if we don't, as Tanya says, admit it and acknowledge it, we will never change it. And then we have to have the collective will. So I think the biggest obstacle is Americans, particularly white Americans, have to quit viewing that as a threat to themselves and their own public safety, and instead see that broad community safety is better for us all and provides us all with better safety. And we're seeing right now in this presidential campaign, this president has decided that the specter of, chaos in the streets is what could win. And so he is sowing that kind of division. Of course, he's been, singling out Seattle time and time again. He declared us a anarchy zone. Apparently, Attorney General Barr wanted to have me charged with sedition or other crimes. And that shows you that instead of using the power of their positions to better America, they want to continue those same obstacles and those same divisions, which are the largest thing, I think, that keeps us from doing what we need. So I think we need collective political will, but I have to tell you, corporations have to play a role. And I am so grateful to having Microsoft and other corporations who time and time again, through their philanthropy, help us. But I want corporations to stand up and say, you know what? We're going to make sure that we return X percentage of the money to our workforce. And $15 an hour isn't enough. We're going to make sure that their kids can go to school, that they have a pension plan they can count on, that they have health care their family can count on. And our shareholders will get less money, but they're going to get greater community safety. We have to reframe how we approach. I don't think we're going to get rid of capitalism, and I think it can do good, but we have shifted trillions of dollars from working people to the richest Americans. And until we change that obstacle, we will be fighting over what's left with the great poverty and great other challenges we have in America, and it is racialized poverty.
So much of what you said resonates very deeply, Mayor Durkan. I appreciate that, but in particular, I want to call out the idea that racial equity is community safety. that's something that we all need to embrace. So I very much appreciate you raising that amongst the host of other incredible points you just laid out. I want to get to Chief Dekmar and Commissioner Harrison on this same question from the law enforcement side and how you see coordination, because so much of your responsibility is up and down to the elected, to the people and the communities that you serve. As you think about the future of public safety that we want to capture, that we've been trying to define through these conversations and thinking about community safety, how do you think about those coordination obligations and responsibilities, and what would make it easier for you to do your jobs as you build out that kind of programming in police forces? Starting with Commissioner Harrison, if you could.
Yeah, James, thank you for that. When I arrived in Baltimore a year and a half ago, I started talking about root causes of crime. And the culture here in Baltimore has been a total reliance on police for public safety and to make people feel safe and to make, this a safe community. And the criteria is the murder rate. While Baltimore either holds the #1 or the #2 murder rate in the country, that's totally unacceptable, but it's been a total reliance on police alone to do that. And there's been no harm reduction programs. There have been no prevention and intervention issues. And we're now bringing another focused deterrence model back that we're building, which hasn't been here in many years, to move away from a total reliance on police. But I've been talking about fixing and actually coordinating, rather, the investment and the improvement in all of the issues that are root cause drivers: the homeless issue, the addiction issue, which is probably the worst in the country, the education problem here in the city, the joblessness, and the skill set that leads to those jobs. And fixing all of that is what we have to make those investments in. And it has to be a coordinated effort. I found that there are many people doing great work, many nonprofits, academic institutions, faith-based institutions doing great work, but they're siloed. And there's no coordinated effort. And what there needs to be is a coordinated effort through the elected officials to the nonprofits, both faith-based, academic-based, and everybody here, at least in our city, and I'm sure other cities are just like that. It's siloed, but it needs to be a coordinated effort to move in away from a total reliance on police and have a multidisciplinary, comprehensive approach to not just reducing crime, but preventing crime and making communities safe. How we do that is a difficult challenge, but people have to sometimes release the reins of their own power to come into a coordinated effort. That's a heavier lift than what people are willing to lift.
Releasing the reins of your own power. That's the humility and the trust in others that I think we've heard come up a few times, and a really important point. Thank you.
The one thing every leader needs more than anything, and it's the thing that we often least exhibit, is humility. We find strength in humility, and it's our humility that makes us align ourselves with what's best for the city and not what's best for me.
Can't say it better than that. Chief Dekmar.
Yeah, this has been a challenging time for policing. I saw an article come out 2 weeks ago, public confidence in police at a 30-year low. So I pull up the Gallup poll, and it is reviewed 16 institutions. We dropped to 48% confidence. Public schools were at 41, newspapers at 24, Congress at 13. Of the 16 institutions, we dropped from 3rd to 4th. I had to ask myself, how can we have the worst year in 30 years and still have relatively high public confidence? And the reason, I think, is that when people are asked about the police, they don't think about what they've seen on TV. They think about, what was my last experience? Now, it's easier to take comfort in those numbers, but then if you bear on down and you look at the race, it's about half or less. So I agree with the mayor in that we have to admit and acknowledge, but we also have to be intentional about what do we do to address the past historic, institutionalized, discriminational practices that we've seen. I can name some. One of the panelists alluded to, record restriction for employment. Our police department was the first in the state to take the record restriction legislation, meet with the judges, prosecutors, court clerks, get them to agree to waive fees, and we acted as the ombudsman. And I think we've so far been successful in restricting the records of around 500 individuals that were arrested but not convicted. And when an employer runs it for employment purposes, that arrest doesn't show. Prison reentry, working with parole and probation, so that we meet with them along with the 40 or 50 different organizations, faith-based, other government entities, nonprofits that are available to them, and reminding them, if you think you're jammed up, don't commit a crime, contact us, let us show you one of our partners that might be able to help you out. Car care program, when we stop folks, instead of giving them a ticket, we've worked with all of our parts stores and given them discount coupons so they can get that defective piece of equipment taken care of. We've got 38 different initiatives. Many agencies have those. And I think the reason that we have relatively high confidence level when these other institutions don't, 4th out of 16, is because the day-to-day work by the police is problem solving and social work, and they do it effectively. In those cases where they don't, they ought to be held to strict account. That's number one. Number two, city councils, state legislators need to quit criminalizing mischief. Eric Gardner, what was he arrested for? Selling loose cigarettes. Who created that? City council. The state of Washington, Mayor, your Supreme Court said as a matter of public policy, union arbitrators' decisions are more important than the public policy of officers testifying truthfully or answering truthfully in a internal investigation. So unions and officer misconduct that oftentimes is marginalized by arbitrators ought not be the public policy. The public policy ought to be sound public policy of officers are expected to perform consistent with the standards and always, always be truthful. Integrity is paramount to what we do. And finally, our position as police officers, recognizing that I think we're in the third evolution of change for police. The first was the Wickersham Commission in the 30s that did its best to eliminate the politicization of policing. Then the Presidential Commission in the 60s on crime, where we recognized that training was absolutely important if we're going to address the issue of civil rights violations and police missteps. And now a recognition that the police are in a key position to be the ombudsman and use the bully pulpit to bring focus on those issues in a community that, if not addressed, are going to result in crime and unsafe communities.
Good way to round out this particular segment. That we're in the third evolution of policing and the history from Wickersham to Kerner to 21st century policing, and that evolution is incredibly important as part of our data set going into this visioning exercise on the future of public safety. Thanks so much, Chief. I want to bring in Celia and Marissa very quickly on questions of the private sector and the business community, because it's so important for us to be able to have all voices at the table in this ecosystem of reform that we've talked about time and again throughout this series. But we would love to hear from you both, from your positions. What is most important, and what would you like to see from your counterparts in the business community in playing their part in corporate responsibility and trying to help define and capture a new future of public safety? Starting with Marissa, if you please.
Sure, thanks. This is a huge question, and I know we only have a few minutes, and I want to make sure Celia has time, but just something that as an overarching frame for how I think of it, or if I could write down my wish for how we could see corporate America engage, is the fundamental recognition that, of course, we need to take care of our own employees, but that's kind of table stakes. I think that an acknowledgement of how fundamentally important it is that the health of the communities in which within which we operate and to whom we sell, and that for a large corporation like ours, it's basically the globe, but that our destiny as a company, our success of our shareholders, our customers, is built upon the success and the health and the safety of the communities within which we operate. And I think about recently, this doesn't have to do directly with the justice system, but it makes me think about some of our broader conversations about skilling and workforce development. And basically in the state of Washington, we advocated for companies like ours to pay more in taxes so we could support more investment in higher education, and not just colleges and universities, but also community colleges, and making subsidized tuition more accessible to more people and more students, because we know that isn't just doing something for the good of benefiting the community. We are direct beneficiaries of having a strong and thriving and skilled workforce. We need that. We want that. And so why wouldn't we put our skin in the game to make sure that can happen? So I think that's just an analogy. If you could port over to other aspects of the conversation we've been having about how, our destinies are wrapped up within each other. And the more we can recognize that reality, I think will guide how corporations can best lean in to be collaborative, helpful partners with government, with nonprofits, with activist organizations.
See you there.
James, you can't leave me with like 3 seconds to answer this question, considering it's the entire function of my organization. But here is
You can give us the elevator pitch, right? I know you can do it.
Here is the speedy version. I want businesses to be part of creating change. And they sort of increasingly know that they must be. I think what Marisa said about how they advocated for change in a law in Washington is a really good example, right? And I want businesses to recognize their power and their platforms and use them to lift up the voices and the needs of those that are least powerful in our communities. This is compelling. This is when Goliath stands up for David, right? This is when those that have been systematically deprived of a voice pair up with somebody that or an entity that has traditionally had a very, very, very loud voice. And I know I keep naming it, but we know a lot of the answers to what we should be doing, but political will isn't there, and businesses are very, very, very powerful when it comes to educating and influencing law and policy. And this isn't necessarily partisan. I think a really good example of that, and maybe a spark of hope, happened in Ohio today when the Senate president spoke in favor of a bill that unanimously passed the Senate, overwhelmingly passed the Senate, on the abolition of juvenile life without parole sentencing. And this wasn't an economic perspective, and there was significant business involvement in this. The messaging actually was around redemption. So this isn't sort of necessarily a partisan issue. This is a question of are businesses doing everything that they can to leverage every asset in their arsenal to create change? The second part of my answer is businesses must use their innovation potential. I do think Microsoft is an excellent example of that. I'm really glad Marisa is on this panel. Businesses are amazing at solving problems. They are good at investing, and they can create change and innovate through their partnerships, not just with diverse members of the community, but literally through their contracts, who they choose to contract with, what they put in their contractual requirements about who those partners are, who's in their supply chain, what are they doing with their investment portfolio? Are they strategically divesting from practices and entities that are perpetuating the current crisis, if we can call it that, in mass incarceration in the US? And so that process of investment, and I promise I'm finishing, really to me comes back to this sort of an analysis of power and addressing power imbalances. So when businesses look at, for example, putting a bank in a traditionally underserved or underinvested in community, are they also thinking about empowering that community? Maybe they're making zero balance bank accounts available. Maybe they're eliminating overdraft fees for certain clients. When they're thinking about creating jobs, are they thinking about creating good jobs. We see a massive number of particularly Black women that have been incarcerated that do have a job, but these are occasional and very fragile jobs. Are we seeing jobs that allow progress and allow opportunities for advancement and for leadership? So to break it down, I think businesses always need to be looking at what they could and should be doing externally, but they always need to be also looking at what they are doing internally to empower and equip and change their internal practices to really align with what needs to change in our communities.
Thank you so much for that, Celia. All really important points. And we are unfortunately almost out of time. We've got just enough time to do a quick fire on the last question that I've been asking all of our panelists throughout this series, to, if you can, identify 3 things that you would like to see happen immediately. If you could wave your magic wand, it would help us make progress to be able to define and capture the future of public safety that we've just talked about. What would those 3 things be? And we have 6 panelists because Mayor Durkin had to leave for another engagement, but we will start with Tanya, please.
Okay, I'm going to go rapid fire here. Number 1, economic justice, right? An end to shareholder-first capitalism, an end to executive compensation self-dealing, tax reform, businesses that pay people living wages. So that's number 1. Number 2, an end to mass criminalization in favor of a public health approach to crime and social welfare. Number 3, my third gift I'd like to see to the world is a racial equity framework for government investment in education, housing, health.
Boom. Perfect exemplar. Now everybody has to do it as efficiently as Tanya does. Chief Dekmar, if you can.
Sure. Police ought to seek cooperative compliance, not coercive compliance with the law. If folks understand the reason and they're educated as to why compliance is important, what you get is a sense of community's combined effort to address those sort of issues that affect public safety. Leveraging local resources so they complement one another, and in many instances don't require immediate additional resources, but the coordination of those resources, and for police to understand the principle that the laws are created as tools to solve problems, not as clubs to beat people up.
Love it. Marisa.
Sure, to be real quick here, mine are more conceptual. Number 1 would be, meaningful listening across sectors and across communities. Number 2, a shared sense of urgency. But number 3, tempered by sustained commitment to change.
Commissioner Harrison.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Number 1, change of legislation at the state levels that truly allows police executives to truly run those organizations and discipline officers with community expectations built into it, that prohibits unions from collectively bargaining management rights away from management, that protects the officers. Number 2, policies, trainings, and protocols that require limit uses of force and high levels of community engagement, that really create a community policing centric organization, really away from the warrior and into the guardian model policing. And number 3, prioritization of the type of police services we deploy. Right away, what can we right now say that we do and not do, so that we can only do what we're supposed to be doing and let the other professionals handle those other things.
Fantastic. Celia.
Now I have to go after 12 brilliant examples, answers. Okay, number 1, investment in crime prevention and a complete readdressing of what crime even means and should be considered criminal behavior. Turning off the faucet at the source surely has to be an answer here. Significant innovation and motivating will to accept innovation and to change. And then number 3, we have to have accountability built into this. We can come up with all the great ideas and talk about them and put them into place, but if in a year's time no one's being held accountable and there's no monitoring, this is kind of all for nothing.
Fantastic. And Daryl closes out.
Yeah, I always believe in carrots and sticks, James. My 3 are all sticks right now. Data transparency, North Carolina has had a Racial Profiling Act since 1999. We're going to be launching NC Cop Watch, which is going to identify the attributes of 25 million stops, searches, and uses of force incident to those stops. And that's going to be for North Carolina communities to hold their police departments accountable. In public official and sovereign immunity, if me as a litigator, if I can come after that pension, if I can come after that house, you're going to think twice about shooting my people in the street. Number 3, feed different incentives, right? At the federal level, you know, we had the COPS office, we got federal burn JAG funding that funds a lot of the militarization around local police departments. We need to change that SKU mix and fund different incentives.
Thank you so much. That was the fastest of all the groups that we've done. So everybody gets a gold star for their lightning round 3 things. I want to thank everybody for being on this panel. Tanya, Daryl, Chief Deckmar, Commissioner Harrison, Celia, and Marisa. This has been a wonderful conversation. And of course, thanks to Mayor Durkin, who had to leave a little bit early. This has been another really rich discussion around investing in safer communities. And I very much appreciate the perspectives provided here, giving us that sense of the ecosystem of reform as we think about how we define public safety and move forward from here. Each of the voices that you, the viewing audience, just heard, I think laid out a wonderful roadmap for how we can think more holistically about our progress and our process. This is the penultimate in our series of conversations. The last is next week on October 1st. And so I hope everybody will be able to tune in and listen to that last discussion. Please keep your questions and thoughts and ideas rolling in, and we'll endeavor to include them in the next discussion. Thanks so much for your participation and for listening and for being with us. Take care.